War is hell. It's an old adage, but an accurate one. The death, loss, and suffering which comes from violent conflict touches everyone involved, civilians and soldiers alike, and on all sides of the dispute. No one walks away unscathed. Some wars are necessary, of course. Nations have the right to defend themselves against unprovoked aggression, and populations are sometimes justified in rising up against oppressive governments and dictators. Wars can result in acts of bravery and heroism that are unparalleled in human history, but they will also unleash some of our darkest impulses, unlocking primal instincts and justifying terrible acts of violence which would be considered murder in times of peace. But the many conflicts we've seen over the centuries all have one thing in common: they've all been fought between human beings. But the final war, if and when it comes, will be one for the survival of our species, as we come together to desperately resist the legions of hell. By now you've no doubt read the accounts of my predecessors, the history enthusiast who visited a secret museum telling the story of a future apocalypse, and the student who unwittingly stumbled into an alternate universe, attending a lecture charting hell's victory over Allied and Axis forces during World War II. And who am I, you might ask? Well, that's not really important. I wish to remain anonymous for my own reasons, but let's just say that I have a vested interest in these tales of hellish conquests and extinction events. Many will write them off as nothing more than scary stories on the internet, but I always believed there was more to it. I went out to seek the truth, and I found it. A big part of me wishes I hadn't embarked on this dangerous quest. The acts of bloody violence and wanton slaughter I've witnessed, those appalling images will be burned into my memory forever. But still, I alone have seen the full picture, and I'm here to tell you the truth. Yes, we are facing a terrible fight for survival, and sadly many will suffer and die. But the outcome of the final war is not inevitable, and we are not facing this threat alone. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning. My fascination, or rather obsession, with the myth of the final war led me to some dark corners of the internet and far-flung places in my relentless search for clues. It was one of these hidden forums that led me to a unique living history tour, which one anonymous poster described as a life-changing experience. I recognized the code words, knowing how a similar post had led the history enthusiast to the hidden museum. And so, my curiosity got the better of me, and I took the bait. The location of the tour was marked by GPS coordinates. When I looked it up on Google Maps, I instantly had an eureka moment. The starting point of the tour was a field just south of Thiepval, on the banks of the River Somme in northeast France. This was, of course, the site of one of the bloodiest battles in human history back during the blood-soaked summer of 1916. As Allied and German forces fought a horrific war of attrition in the muddy fields and trenches along a front line that barely moved in years. From my research, it seems that evil always enters our realm in these theaters of mass violence, using the blood and the darkness to their benefit and drawing strength from the death and suffering to support their hellish invasion. This was the lead I'd been waiting for. I felt sure of it. I live in the UK, and so I traveled by car, embarking on the Eurotunnel shuttle from Folkestone to Calais and driving east to the Somme. I felt an incredible poignancy as I drove through the French countryside en route to Thiepval, passing the numerous graveyards and memorials. So many thousands had lost their lives here little over a century ago, churned up in the bloody inferno of industrial warfare. If I'd had the time, I would have liked to pay my respects to the dead, but sadly my mission was too important and I couldn't afford any distractions. I arrived about half an hour before the tour was due to start. This was intentional, as I wanted to learn the lay of the land before all hell broke loose, if you'll excuse the pun. I parked up alongside a narrow and seemingly abandoned country road at the exact spot the GPS coordinates had led me to. The location was quiet and peaceful, the sun shining down upon a field of red poppies, a beautiful but poignant display given the poppies' emotive symbolism and close connection to the terrible losses suffered during the Great War. There was no one around that I could see. I spotted a farmhouse about half a mile to the north and could make out the banks of the Somme on the western horizon, but there wasn't another living soul in sight. For a brief moment, I forgot why I was there, enjoying the sunshine and fresh air and listening to the birds singing. I opened the gate and walked out into the field, picking a poppy and holding it in the palm of my hand. It was peaceful, but this wouldn't last. He appeared in the corner of my eye, making me jump in fright. I turned to face the man who stood behind me. I knew he hadn't been there a moment before, and so his sudden appearance was disconcerting, even though I'd been warned to expect such an event. The physical appearance of the man largely matched the descriptions in the previous accounts, as he appeared near identical to the museum curator and university lecturer. He wore thick reading glasses and a tweed suit, whilst sporting a tidy beard and short haircut. I don't know whether it's the same individual in every story. Probably not. The more likely explanation is this: the entity has chosen to assume the identity of a seemingly harmless academic type. In reality, of course, he's anything but. It's his eyes that give him away, however, filled as they are with a barely concealed malice. He smiled thinly as he spoke, calling out to me across the field and speaking in a polite but somehow also sinister tone of voice. "Good morning, sir. What a pleasure to meet your acquaintance." He marched across the field, the innate grin still on his lips as he held out his hand in an act of false friendship. I reluctantly shook his hand, not wishing to blow my cover at this early stage. A chill went through me as I touched his ice-cold palm and looked into his dark, hateful eyes. "Have you come far?" he asked, whilst maintaining his amicable pretense. "Yes, quite far," I replied, but the drive was rather pleasant. "Oh, excellent, excellent," he replied enthusiastically. "Well, I see no reason for further formalities. An educated man such as yourself knows the lay of the land. So, shall we begin our tour?" His choice of words concerned me. I wasn't surprised that the tour guide was expecting me. Somehow, they always knew when we were coming. But did he know my true agenda? I certainly hope not, because this would place me in extreme danger. Even at this late stage, I considered turning on my heels and running back to my vehicle, but I'd come this far and knew I had to see this through. "Sounds good," I responded, noting the sly glint in the tour guide's eye and his cruel smile which never faltered. But there was a further twist in the tale to come. A moment later, and a second figure appeared by our side, seeming to materialize out of thin air. I looked upon what appeared to be an elderly woman, hunched over and walking with the aid of a stick. Her head was covered by a shawl, and she also wore a heavy winter coat despite the fact it was a warm summer's day. She glanced across at me, smiling sweetly and exerting a positive aura that was in stark contrast to that of the devilish tour guide. Her skin was wrinkled, but her eyes still retained a bright spark, and she surprised me by shooting me a sly wink. I was both shocked and concerned by the old woman's presence here. The previous accounts hadn't mentioned anything about a third party being present during the event. I worried that this vulnerable lady had unwittingly stumbled into this very dangerous situation. My anxiety only increased when I noticed the guide's reaction to her sudden appearance. I watched in dismay as his face turned red with rage, and he angrily spat out his words. "And who are you? What the hell are you doing here?" His tone was very aggressive, but as it turned out, the old lady was more than a match for him. "Good sir, I will ask you to show some manners. I am a guest who wishes to join your tour. Is this not permitted?" she asked. "It is out of the question," the guide shot back. "I have my guest, and this tour is one-on-one." She glanced over at me, a spark in her eye as she said, "I'm sure this gentleman won't mind if I tag along. What do you say, young man?" My mind was racing. I didn't want the mystery woman jeopardizing my mission, but at the same time felt reluctant to offend her. I stuttered my reply, saying, "Well, not as such, but I didn't get the chance to finish my sentence as she cut me off abruptly. "There, you see, it is not a problem. You'll hardly know I'm here." The guide still looked furious, glaring hatefully at the woman and then at me before he regained some level of self-control. Fine, he finally relented, but you must not interrupt my talk or interfere with the tour in any way. Otherwise, there will be hell to pay. I recognized a threat when I heard it, but the lady didn't seem to notice the sinister undertone behind his words, merely nodding her head and replying, "I'll be no trouble at all. Don't you worry, good sir." "Very well. Then let us begin," the guide continued, whilst motioning out towards the poppy-covered fields. "Welcome guests to this most solemn and sacred of sites. As you are aware, this location was the scene of one of the bloodiest battles of the 20th century. In the late summer of 1914, the European powers went to war, with an alliance of Britain, France, and Russia pitted against the Central Powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. The German High Command launched their Schlieffen Plan, mounting an invasion of Belgium and northeast France with the aim of capturing Paris and forcing the French out of the war. The German plan failed, however, as their armies were pushed back from the French capital and a bloody war of attrition followed, with neither side able to make significant headway. Terrible weaponry was deployed: artillery, machine guns, poison gas. Casualties were horrific, and the blood-soaked, muddy, and rat-infested trenches soon turned into a hell on earth. During the summer of 1916, Allied forces launched their long-awaited offensive along the River Somme. The attack was preceded by a huge artillery bombardment lasting days. The British believed the German defenses couldn't survive such a heavy bombardment, but they were wrong. What followed was a bloodbath, one which ultimately resulted in 1 million casualties and made little change to the front. Right here where we stand, the British X-Corps pushed forward across no man's land on the 1 July 1916, the bloodiest day in the history of the British Army. On this ground, just over 100 years ago, thousands of men died under a rain of fire. It's hard to imagine such death and suffering occurred here, isn't it? Yes, I answered truthfully as I cast my eyes over the tranquil fields. Time is a great healer, the old woman added. Well, time isn't something which concerns us here. We offer a unique experience, one which allows our guests to see and hear firsthand what war is really like. I stared at the tour guide in confusion, asking, "What do you mean?" The guide smiled sadistically and my heart froze, because I knew something bad was coming. But the trick that bastard pulled was really unexpected. All he had to do was click his fingers to turn the world upside down. I felt a surge of energy and was temporarily blinded by an intense light brighter than the sun. I fell down to my knees, covering my eyes behind my hands. And when I opened them again, I found myself in another place, or more accurately another time. The poppy fields, trees, tidy fences, and farmhouse were replaced by a dead landscape of mud, barbed wire, and shell craters. The sun had risen on the far horizon, but there was no joy in this new morning. As soon as I surveyed my surroundings, my eardrums were almost burst by a series of almighty explosions, an unholy fire raining down from above. I looked to the east and saw the shells falling, the blasts hitting the trench line and concrete bunkers. When I turned to the west, I saw the guns lighting up on horizon with a second trench line in front of them. To my horror, I realized we'd been transported back to July 1916, right in the middle of the battle. What's worse, the three of us were standing in no man's land between the British and German lines. I told myself it couldn't be possible, that this must be an optical illusion of some kind. But it all seemed so real: the mud beneath my feet, the thundering sound of the artillery barrage, and even the smell, the cordite. Smoke and awful stench of rotting corpses. I was understandably terrified because I'd suddenly found myself standing in the most dangerous spot on Earth, stuck between two industrial-age armies and their deadly array of weaponry. But when I looked to my mysterious companions, I saw they had no such fear.